Good morning. Welcome to this week's episode of Learn with Lorna, number 164. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland, looking after documents relating to this lovely part of the world. We have a centre in Inverness, one in Fort William, one in Portree, and one in, where have I missed? Wick. Together, the 4 of those make up the Highland Archive Service. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that. It enables us to do not only our statutory functions, but also much more in terms of engagement and outreach and all of those fun and important things. So thank you very much if you're able to do that. So thank you for joining me this week. Jen, Australia, excellent. You can correct me if any of my comments on Australia are wrong. Northern Ireland, yes, cold. Yeah, we've had snow here, so yes, definitely changing season now. So welcome to this episode where we're continuing to look at the Highland diaspora. We've looked already at links to North America that we have in our collections. This week we're looking at links to Australia and New Zealand. So this week, as I say, I've been going through our collections to see where I can find reference to that. Again, like when I spoke about North America, this is again a story of emigration and new chances, as much as it is a story of courts and punishment and transportation and hard times. Britain has a long history of transporting and banishing convicted criminals, and that's where we're going to start. Sometimes people would be transported out of the parish or out of the borough if they had done something wrong. Sometimes they would be sent much further afield. And where they were sent to depended on their crime, and particularly on the date that the crime took place, but also where in Britain they were when they did it, because Scotland often had different laws to the rest of the UK. Criminals could be transported out of Scotland, and they were in earlier centuries. But up until the early 1700s, it was really an unstructured basis. Individual merchants would maybe agree to take out a few prisoners, a few convicts on a case-by-case basis, often at that point to North America or to the West Indies. But as this problem increased, it became clear that a more formal, more organised system was needed. And in the 1718-1719, the Transportation Act was passed. And that allowed the government to give transportation contracts out. That applied in England and Wales. Actually, the Act specifically didn't include Scotland. We'll come back to that. But the passing of this Transportation Act enabled Britain as a whole to remove large swathes of the criminal population by sending them to America, where they would also serve the dual purpose of populating that colony, bolstering the workforce, things like producing tobacco in Virginia. They worked alongside slave labour. However, as I said, Scotland didn't officially come under that Transportation Act, but there were still elements of transportation happening that was smaller, it was more sporadic. Between around 1718 and 1775, there were roughly 50,000 convicts sent to America, and they would be sent for either 7 years, 14 years, or for life. But, and you're maybe wondering why I'm starting talking about America in an episode about Australia and New Zealand, but it does make sense. As we discussed in that American episode 154, the American Wars of Independence put a stop to this. It meant that the colonies that Britain had been in the habit of sending convicts to were no longer a viable option. And so the British had to look about for an alternative penal colony. And they chose Australia. And in 1787, the first ships landed in Botany Bay. And over predominantly the next 30 years, but it did go on beyond that, there were tens of thousands of convicted criminals sent to Van Diemen's Land, which is Tasmania, and to New South Wales. After 1820, this practice started to become less common, and it was officially ended in 1868. But that practice and that relationship between Britain and between Australia has obviously formed a huge part of the connection that we have with Australia. As I said, the Highlands did send convicts, although not a huge number, as Scotland in general didn't transport in huge numbers. But, oh, that's interesting, Jen. You'll see as I come on to talk about this episode, that's a great summary. Some being transported and some going to Australia in search of a better life. Excuse me. So the Highlands did send some convicts, some criminals to Australia, but not in vast numbers. One of the most useful resources on any kind of emigration or movement of people from Scotland are the books of David Dobson, who is an absolute font of knowledge on this subject. So I looked through these reference books, The Scots in Australasia, he wrote these in 1994. So I started to look through to see if I could find examples of Highlanders who had gone. It's a very interesting introduction as well, where he talks about the fact that Scotland has always had people moving in and out of it, that process of convicts and then the process of voluntary emigration. So I looked through these books to see if I could find references to Highlanders who had gone. And I found some who were sent out of Highland courts. So for instance, Charles Cameron, butcher in Inverness, sentenced in 1811 to transportation for 14 years for sheep stealing. Joseph Hay, son of James Hay, tenant in Kiln Hill, Aldern, guilty of arson and fire raising, sentenced in 1785. George Cormac, thief, sentenced to transportation for 14 years in 1826. William Mackintosh, travelling chapman or peddler, guilty, which I assume comes from chapping the door. I'll look into that. William Mackintosh was found guilty of stabbing at Fort William. He was sentenced in Inverness in September 1809 to be transported for life. So again there you can see those instances of transported for 7 years, for 14 years, or for life. But realistically, very few people would have been able to afford to come back. Following up William Mackintosh's case, a look at the Inverness Journal gives us a bit more detail. It says that he had been sentenced to transportation for life because he had stabbed someone 7 times with a Highland knife in Fort William in the night. Apparently the person lost so much blood that they thought at first that they were dead, but then they found he was taken in and looked after and made a recovery, but this crime was sufficient that transportation for life was the sentence. All of those cases that I've looked at, I've then gone in to look in our court process papers and found that we have all of the papers for those individuals. And as I've said before, we don't hold the trial papers, so we don't hold all the evidence, all the witness statements and so on, but we hold the process papers, the paper that documents the fact that he is being transported and how that's going to work. So if we stay with William Mackintosh, the one who did the stabbing in Fort William, the warrant for this banishment gives us the additional detail that he resided at the farm of Achintor in the parish of Kilmally. It records that his sentence was to be transported beyond the seas to such part or place as his majesty, by and with the advice of his privy council, shall appoint, and to go for all the days of his life. It notes as well that if he had been found in Britain or Ireland again, he would be sentenced to death. If that's not harsh enough, I have mentioned this once before, I think, in a previous episode. What I find particularly chilling, and I'd be interested to know if other people have the same connotation, at the end of the document it says that on awaiting transportation to the colonies, he will be held in the prison hulks on the Thames. And that to me is just such a immediate flash of Dickensian imagery of Great Expectations, of the marshes, of the hulks with all the convicts held on them in the Thames at the Woolwich hulks, suffering illness and dense population of those ships, brutal conditions. So I would be interested to see if the word the hulks always has that immediate effect on me. So we've got this connection with Australia, with transporting criminals. But of course that's only one part of our connection to Australia, and transporting convicts was never part of our relationship with New Zealand, although many are likely to have gone on to New Zealand from Australia. So if we go on and have a look at some of the many thousands of people who left the Highlands for Australia and New Zealand voluntarily instead, and I do use the word voluntarily loosely, I think for many of them they felt they had very little other choice, but they are certainly more voluntary than the convicts would have been. If we look at the second statistical account for Ardnamurchan from 1845, that mentions that in 1837 to 1838, 100 individuals left for Australia. And when I looked that up, it was 10% of the population left for Australia in that 1 year. And that's only the ones who went to Australia. There are also many others who went to America and to Canada who are referenced there as well. But that really struck me, 10% of the Ardnamurchan population. If we look at the second statistical account for Strath in the Isle of Skye, that mentions that 200 have left for Australia in the past few years. And this extract is from the Lagan statistical account. At the date of the former statistical account, so this is the second, they're looking back at the first, the number of people in this parish was 1,512. At the census of 1831, it had decreased to 1,196. So what's that? Almost a third of a decrease. This decrease may be accounted for by the introduction of sheep and the throwing of several small farms into sheep walks. Many of the inhabitants have emigrated to America, many more are preparing to go to Australia. In some parts of the parish, where about 80 years ago there was a dense population, there are now to be found only a few scattered shepherds' huts. And as I say, we know that many of those who emigrated, recorded here as emigrating to Australia, went on to New Zealand. So if we have a look at some of the letters we have that illustrate that, here's an 1878 letter from the Rutherford of Helmsdale collection. This says, written from the SS Durham in Plymouth, Thursday 6 p.m. My dear sir, we are just about to lift anchor and leave Britain's shores behind us, and I devote the few minutes now left to say goodbye to you all, and to the many friends in Sutherland who we leave behind us. We are all in excellent health and spirits, and we have the prospect of a pleasant voyage. We shall of course be glad to hear from you all at every port. Meantime, any letters addressed to us at Menzies Hotel, Burke Street, Melbourne, will reach us while we're in Australia, and even after that, because they can be reposted every third day or so from Melbourne to New Zealand, so they'll still get the letters when they arrive in New Zealand. But he gives some detail about the journey. Robert has written you from here. He says he also wrote to you from Edinburgh, so writing at every stage of the journey away from the Highlands. He has got Charlie Morrison for cabin companion, a very steady and exemplary young man. It is a pity that Robert didn't make provision for his cabin bedding, etc. before coming on board, as it could have been got much cheaper. As it was, it cost £5 5s, as Uncle John would have told you. Charlie Morrison is going by the first boat from Melbourne to New Zealand, and Robert will have his company all the way. Of the £45 I received on Robert's account, viz. £40 at Helmsdale and £5 from Uncle John, I have paid 15, 15 and 7 for half passage. I have spent 550 for bedding, altogether £21 and 7p. After paying passage at Melbourne to New Zealand, the balance will be 14, 9 and 5, and I shall send that from Melbourne to the bank at Dunedin to await him when he arrives. So it's just really interesting there to get that detail of the cost and the practicalities, but reference there to the fact that he's going to Australia but going straight on to New Zealand. And that's echoed in this 1857 letter held in Lochaber Archive Centre, in which the writer says, having been in Van Diemen's Land, so Tasmania, I can tell you something about that place. viz. That I liked it very much and found it very healthy and a fine farming country. But he says it's hard to get hold of land without capital because all the land is now sold at a very high rate and many are now going on to New Zealand. But then he also says, if you can do anything at home, stick there would be my advice. Interesting. Interesting as well in that Rutherford letter that he says, you know, we have every expectation of a pleasant journey. But actually, we know that often the journeys were not pleasant. I've referenced frequently the letter by William Michael of Smeaton Hill, in which he writes back to his brother in Lairg, describing the terrible conditions on board the ships. He says the foul air destroys the children and instructs the family not to bring anybody weak on board. So journeys were always long and often difficult. They often took months and months, and often arriving with far fewer passengers than had set off. One of the most famous ships to make this journey was the Hercules, which left Scotland in December 1852 and didn't arrive in Melbourne until August 1853. It was part of the Highlands and Islands Emigration Society, a scheme that had been set up in 1852 with the aim of relieving the crisis of destitution that was engulfing the Highlands by assisting people to emigrate. And over the next 5 years, this scheme alone, and there were other schemes, but this scheme alone would help nearly 5,000 people go from the Highlands, and predominantly from the Western Highlands, to Australia. A large proportion of them went from Skye. And I wanted to share with you some extracts from the Highlands and Islands Emigration Society rules. This is a collection which is held at the National Records of Scotland. You can also find it on Scotland's People. But this is how it describes the rules of the society. The emigration will be conducted as much as possible by entire families and in accordance with the rules. 2. Passengers to Australia are provided by the commissioners from colonial funds for able-bodied men and women of good character and not exceeding a specified age, with a certain proportion of children, on production of a stated quantity and description of clothing, and on paying a deposit of from £1 to £2 for adults and 10 shillings for children. For persons exceeding a specified age, a larger amount of deposit is required. This is very similar to emigrating today, where you need to be often going into an industry that's needed. It's harder to emigrate if you're over a certain age. It goes on to say, emigrants asking for aid will be required to apply all their available means to defraying the expense of their outfits and deposits. So give as much as you can towards it. 3. The Society will advance the sum necessary to make good whatever may be deficient for these purposes, as far as its funds will admit, in the districts to which it may be determined to extend its operations. And 4, it's in Roman numerals, and for some reason I got them muddled up. The owners or trustees of the property from which the emigrants depart will be expected to pay 1/3 of the sum disbursed on account of the emigrants by the Society. So landowners are to contribute. But also, the emigrants will be required to repay the Society the whole of the sum advanced to them, which will again then be applied in the same manner. So they had to pay it back, which would then go back into supporting more people to emigrate. It goes on to detail the sort of people who would be suitable for the Highlands and Islands Emigration Society. Sober, industrious, good moral character, able to work, willing to work, healthy both physically and mentally. And numerous ships went out, but the Hercules was the one which was due to take the biggest number of passengers, 756, 758, I've read both estimates, of Highlands and Islands Emigration Society passengers. It had a very difficult start to its journey. Many of the passengers were weak and malnourished before they even started. And the ship left from Campbelltown in December 1852, going via Rothesay and then via Ireland. And that part of the journey alone was horrendous. They faced severe storms, they faced outbreaks of smallpox and typhus fever, and the result was that the ship was placed into quarantine in Ireland, where it sat for 3 months after 56 people died. And apparently 17 children were orphaned as a result of that, who then were sent back to Scotland. Really interesting. I'm sure someone will have traced what happened to those children. Many of the other immigrants at that point were transferred off the Hercules and onto other ships, getting split up. We hold in the Highland Archive Centre a copy of the ship's surgeon report of the Hercules, and it details some of the challenges that were faced, and also the efforts on the subsequent journey from Ireland to Australia to keep the ship ventilated, keep bedding and clothing aired, etc. So the journeys were difficult, often difficult. And that kind of very light-hearted sentence in the Rutherford letter where he says, we've got every expectation of a pleasant journey, and maybe it was, but often they were difficult. So if you've made this difficult journey to get there, what was life like for those immigrants once they got to Australia and New Zealand? Well, we have various different documents that give detail about this, such as those in our Loch Archive Centre, which were written by S. Sibbald from Geelong in Australia, writing back to his brother and sister. And he records Geelong's location, so he says it's situated at the head of the loch. I had a look on the map, I'm not sure it is on the head of a loch, but it is certainly on the head of a huge swathe of water. He says it's a very nice bay it stands on, a most beautiful plain. The south side of it is on a rise from which you have a view of all of the city and the country for many hundreds of miles around. So he describes the geography. He describes the houses. He says there are houses here of tin, of wood, of stone, but mostly there are many tents. He describes the gold diggings at Ballarat and the riots that sometimes broke out there. He says, such reports as would make the blood boil in any man's veins. Believe me, this country is in a very bad state, and I fear that matters may become more serious. He talks about the crops. He says wheat and potatoes in this country are very good, but there's very little of it. Describes the wages, and at the time he's writing, there's been a crisis, and those who were getting 25 shillings a day are now working for 10 or 12 shillings. The letter is full of references to people from home that he has met in Australia and what they've been doing. So he says Hugh Cameron is doing very well at the gold diggings. He's cleared about £350. But like all emigrants' letters that we have, there's often references to meeting other people from Scotland and the conversations they have and the updates they have from each other. He talks about the devastation of the bushfires, which I found really interesting because that's something we associate so much now with Australia in the news. But he says, had a fearful account of all the places around the country for many miles that have been burnt up in flames. None had so much loss as Hugh Grant, for all his hay and wheat was burnt. The cattle will be very badly off now because all the pasture is burnt up. He talks about the locals, and I know some people watching from Australia, so he says, the women here are remarkably handsome and are very extravagant in their ways. Anyone that has a house, and it doesn't matter how small it is, most of them will then have a servant maid who they give at least 26 or £30 per year. So I assume you all have staff in your houses. We hold documents as well relating to the people who went to New Zealand in the mid-1800s. So for instance, Captain Thomas Fraser of Leadcloone, who after serving in the East India Company and then living in France, made the move to New Zealand in 1858 on the ship the Oliver Lang. We hold a copy of some of his correspondence and also his obituary, and his obituary says this. In 1858, he embarked for New Zealand by the ship Oliver Lang and arrived in Wellington towards the close of that year. He came on with as little delay as possible. I'm reading from a newspaper report that is so blurry. He came on with as little delay as possible to Otago and took up pastoral purposes there, purchasing a station at Shag Valley. In 1880 or 1860, he received his introduction to colonial politics, being elected as a member of the House of Representatives for the constituency of, I think it's Walbeth, but like I say, it's very, very blurry indeed, which he held during the term of that parliament. It goes on to say that in May 1870, he was called to the Legislative Council and retained his seat there until his death. He also took a considerable interest in provincial politics and more than once filled the office of Deputy Superintendent. So that's someone descended from the Frasers of Lovat, Fraser of Ledclune, born in Stratherick, has served not only in the East India Company, lived in France, but then gone out to New Zealand and served in politics there. We have letters written back to Inverness in the 1890s by Highlanders who'd made New Zealand home. One is written from Vincent County, Otago, and it details the abundance of food. And I don't know why this one made me smile so much. I think it's the sound of her. She just sounds so frustrated about it. She says, "I am kept pretty busy just now, travelling about on horseback day after day. It becomes very wearisome, riding over the same country month after month. I often think how many thousands of people are starving throughout the world and the good food that goes to waste throughout New Zealand, in the shape of rabbits. Today I counted hundreds of rabbits thriving and being given to the hawks and the seagulls. And all my family, I may say, are very fond of rabbits. If properly cooked in the hospital here, rabbit soup is greatly used and served because the doctors say that it is more nourishing than chicken soup." And I think it's just, it's like anybody who has gone from not having a lot in one place to see the waste in another place. And she's obviously looking at all these rabbits and going, we could be feeding everybody. It made me smile. We even have letters from and items relating to New Zealand's first Anglican bishop in our collection, George Augustus Selwyn, who was connected by marriage to the Fraser-Tytler family, which is why we have his papers. He took part in the first ever Oxford-Cambridge boat race in 1829 and then went on to leave for New Zealand in 1841. I was really interested reading about him. I could have gone down a whole rabbit hole, if you'll excuse the pun, Andrea, seeing your message about rabbit there. I became very interested reading about him. Bishop Selwyn, who had been brought up in England, like I say, he was related to a Highland family by marriage. But he went out to become the first Anglican bishop of New Zealand. He learned Maori on his way out, and he could apparently preach in the Maori language by the time he arrived, so immediately he was able to speak. He campaigned for Maori rights, but that relationship was to sour after the invasion of Waikato. He returned to England in the late 1860s, but apparently he remained very, very attached to New Zealand, and there seem to be many things named after him. There's streets and rivers and whole areas. His son would go on to become Bishop of Melanesia, John Richardson Selwyn. And I looked at the Dictionary of New Zealand Biography because I wanted to get perspective. I wanted to read about him from their perspective, from a New Zealand perspective, because it's very difficult sometimes when we're often the country that's sending people to know really how they were received and felt about. So I was really interested in the Dictionary of New Zealand Biography to read about Bishop Selwyn's final days in New Zealand before returning to England. They say on the 20th of October 1868, after the conclusion of the General Synod in Auckland, a farewell communion service in St Paul's began at 3 p.m. and did not end until 5 p.m. The final communicant to receive the bread and wine from the bishop's hands was the Venerable Ngati Hau, Chief Patrone. And again, forgive my pronunciation. As much as I don't speak Gaelic, I also don't speak Maori. A public holiday was declared to farewell Selwyn, so he deliberately gave his last communion to a Maori chief. Then there's a public holiday, and it says the press of people in the streets was so great that horses were taken out of the shafts and the carriage was instead drawn down to the wharf by young men. The streets were decked with bunting, steamers sounded their whistles, naval vessels fired their guns, and Selwyn arrived back in England on the 31st of December 1868. So it was just very interesting. He had a very controversial career, in some ways very, very well loved, but in some ways making some decisions that seemed very questionable. But apparently his dying words back in England were in Maori, and he said, the Maori words for "it is all light" before he died. As we come into the 20th century, our connection to Australia and New Zealand continues again, with emigration schemes being set up to encourage Scots to go, or people across the wider UK, to go to Australia and New Zealand. Schemes such as £10 POMs, encouraging people to go for work, for opportunity, to repopulate areas. And really interesting, I was down in Glasgow on Monday. My partner's going for an operation, and we were in speaking to the hospital staff. And one of the nurses was from New Zealand, and she told me the story of how her parents had both gone out as £10 POMs, both from Scotland without knowing each other, had met and married in New Zealand, had 5 children, but by that point weren't able to afford to come back to Scotland. And she came back with her mum eventually when she was 20, and she's never left Scotland again, even though her mum went back to New Zealand. So it's just really interesting to see how that dynamic has continued. But I wanted to finish with the document from Nucleus, P618, the memoirs of John Meljon, which he wrote for his son in 1915. He starts it by saying, "I'm an old man and you are still just a very young child, and there's a chance, it's unlikely that we will grow up to have adult conversations together, and so I want to write my memoirs for you." John Meljon's family were from Caithness, and, well, I'll let you hear what his story was. It's quite extraordinary. He goes on to he writes pages and pages. There are probably, 50 or 60 pages in which he details his life story in a huge amount of detail. And I could have picked so many extracts from it. I was completely absorbed in it. But let's start with how he came to leave Scotland at all. When I left, my uncle, my father's, so he's gone from his parents, so his Caithness family, but they're living in Edinburgh. He's gone from his parents to work alongside his uncle. When I left my uncle, my father's affairs must have been getting in a bad way, because he told me he could do nothing for me and I would have to branch out and find a living for myself. I decided to go to the colonies and chose New Zealand, where I had a double uncle and aunt. That is, my father's sister had married my mother's brother, and they had, years before the time of the Maori Wars and about the days of Ballarat, went out to Australia. My uncle had had no luck at Ballarat and had gone over to the gold diggings in the South Island of New Zealand. He was unfortunate there also, and when the Maori War broke out, he joined the military forces, and when it was over, he was given a grant of land at Vairangi, near the Waikato River, in the Auckland province. He bought up other grants from men who had served in the forces who did not wish to settle. He got as much as 100 acres for a few bottles of whisky or £5, and thereby increased his holdings. He lived on his ground through the Second Maori War and brought up a large family there, living through that hard time that the pioneer often has to without recompense. The only recompense that my uncle had was that he lived to see all his family prosper from his efforts. I spent my 18th birthday on the way out to New Zealand, and I well remember the birthday party I had with the shipmates I had chummed up with on board. My mother had sent me away with a cake, and this I had religiously kept for that day. It was all the more welcome as I was travelling steerage and the food on board was not the best. We went out round the Cape of Good Hope. We called in there, but no passenger was allowed on shore as we had a case of smallpox on board, so we could only gaze from the ship to the shore. After leaving Cape Town, our ship went down about 50 degrees south, and it was here I saw my first floating iceberg. It was very, very cold here, and the masts and the rigging were hanging with icicles. Our next land was Tasmania, and we called in at Hobart Town. I felt like a foreigner in a strange land when I got there ashore. The people were certainly English in their speech and in their dress, but it seemed like a dream to me to get into such unusual and such beautiful surroundings. A few days after that, our boat arrived in Auckland, New Zealand. So that's how he came to leave. He also says at the beginning, when he's writing to his son, that he spent much of his childhood reading adventure stories and travel stories in the mid-1800s. And he says, no wonder my life would go on to become what it is. He describes the work that he undertook in New Zealand. Working on a sheep station, 18 years old, he said, I think I'd like to manage a sheep station. And he goes on to say, that you have to forgive my kind of arrogant ambition. I was just young. He worked on a sheep station, he worked in bush felling, and he worked in the Waihi gold mines before gold was discovered there. And for anyone who's been watching me do these talks for some time, they'll know I was out in New Zealand at the end of last year for my sister-in-law's wedding, and that was in Waihi. So I've funny now to think, well, I've been there several times. Now I know somebody who worked there. He describes the hard drinking, hard living, hard working men that he met, and what a shock it was to him as a young 18-year-old to be confronted with these really hard men who drank hard and fought hard. He describes his journeys through New Zealand to Gisborne, to Napier, to Cambridge, and the hospitality he took from the Maori on his way. He said that he found them incredibly hospitable and welcoming, and that he was invited several times to live with Maori families, but he decided not to. He then describes his onward journey, leaving New Zealand after failing to make a fortune, to go to Sydney and then to Melbourne, seeking work and seeking success. What's unusual about John Meljon's story is that he then, having again not had the success he was hoping for in Melbourne, he decides to go home. So he goes back to Scotland. He finds that his father has died. He finds that everything has changed. All his school friends and everybody has moved on. He says he spent 4 months, he saw his mother, saw his brothers and sisters, spent 4 months there and then thought, no, I'm going back. So he goes back to Western Australia this time to go to the Southern Cross goldfield near Perth. And he describes in a huge amount of detail the hardships on the goldfield, the lack of food, particularly the lack of water, really evocative descriptions of the fear he felt having no access to water, and how his head was spinning, and how there was miles to travel to get any water. Here's another extract. During this time we had many privations for want of water and food. If the teams which carried the water did not reach the camp, we had to go without until they came, and then perhaps we would be limited to 1 gallon per day per man to cover all requirements. This meant that we went days without a wash, and also that we rarely had sufficient to drink. As the process of dry blowing or winnowing was used by which to get the gold, this subjected us to a continual red dust which arose, caked our faces and our bodies all over. No man shaved, as water was too precious, and there were no barbers to cut hair, nor were there any scissors in the camp. The consequence was that every man looked wild. Before long, too, every man was in rags and tatters and could not replace his clothing, as there was none to be bought. Canned food was all we could get, and this we used to accompany with a damper bread which is cooked in wood ashes. Needless to say, any canned goods were at a heavy premium. He did find gold, and he sold his claim very well and made his money. So he returned again to Edinburgh and London before going back again to Australia and to New Zealand. Now, if this isn't extraordinary enough in the 1800s, he then goes on. He hears that there's diamond mines in South Africa. So he leaves New Zealand and Australia and he goes to South Africa. He's not very impressed with South Africa. So he goes home again, but he misses the heat. He says it's so cold, everything's dark and cold, and people are dressed darkly, and because of course probably Britain, I'm just trying to think, after Albert died, Victoria would be in mourning, so it would seem like a darker situation to come back to. So he goes to France, and he goes to Monaco, and he says that he does very well at the tables at Monte Carlo. Before he then hears that there's been a gold mine discovered in Canada. So what does he do? Of course, he drops everything and goes to Canada. He describes visiting the Niagara Falls, Montreal, Toronto, the 12-year-old town of Vancouver, where everybody seemed to be asleep to the possibilities around them. The Boer War breaks out, so he goes back to South Africa. And then in 1905, he gets news from Madagascar of the discovery of a gold mine, so off he goes to Madagascar. He does, Andrea, sound like a bit of a lad. I've missed out all the bits where he talks about fighting people to teach them who's got superior fists. So he went off to this gold mine in Madagascar. then travels to Mauritius and again becomes entangled in a war before returning to South Africa and then returning home, where he suffers from an illness that means he can't travel about as much. But I just thought it's such a dramatic story, and as I say, it goes on for pages and pages, and I tried to condense it into 5 minutes for you. But I thought it really nicely rounded off the episode, because some people left the Highlands for Australia and New Zealand as convicts with absolutely no choice. Some people left as the victims of clearance and destitution with very little choice. Some left as adventurers with every choice. Some left as £10 poms to see a better future. Some left as missionaries to see if they could make a difference. Some people returned when their circumstances changed. Some people returned many times. Some people could never return even if they wanted to. And some people didn't want to return because they'd found the better life. And I just found evidence of all of those things. So I hope that I've illustrated some of those different connections. Our connections with Australia and New Zealand run very deep. If you look, as I've mentioned before, my partner's family all are in New Zealand, 3 sisters. So we still feel the pull to go to Australia and New Zealand. We still have programmes like Wanted Down Under and all of those things that encourage people to move between these countries. So I hope I've been able to illustrate some of that for you. Thank you again for joining me. Oh, Linda, thank you for your message. I'm glad it has been an interesting session for you. I'm glad. I hope you can join me next week. Next week I will be looking at some poor relief records from the county of Sutherland. Sorry I have gone over, but as I often say, it's quite hard to condense this level of information into half an hour. So thank you for joining me. I'm glad that you have enjoyed it. Hope you can join me next week. And a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and if you're able to donate towards our work, as there is no charge for these talks, then we would really be grateful for that, and there's a link to be able to do so in the comments. So thank you very much for your company as always. Thank you.